Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Good morning. On this beautiful morning in Galway, we're going to talk about a subject this morning that probably picks up on many of the themes that we've talked about in the past few days and draws them together in a nexus of where the challenges are as Ireland goes forward to another centenary. Perhaps in another 100 years they look back on this conference and think that important things were talked about and future things were talked about. I would like personally to thank Professor Nicholas Canny for the invitation to come to Galway and to chair this session. I would also like to reflect on the sessions very quickly that we've heard to date and some of those themes. The education is central to the development of Ireland. I don't think I need to convince anybody in this room of that. Sean O'Faolain, the Secretary of the Department of Education, I thought put it very elegantly when he talked about the role of education in imagining and building and creating a path for the citizens of the future, providing an area for working together for the common good, intellectual leadership, and also allowing us to understand our past. Professor Pettit, in his lucid dissection of many isms, neo-republicanisms, neoliberalisms, and populism, elaborated on the 5 securities of a republic, and one of those is educational security, a security, he said, that protects us against internal and external aggression. In the long meditation on the history of the 100 years since 1916, Roy Foster gave us an inspiring series of views at different stages and different themes of that 100 years. I took an enormous amount, and I'm sure those of you who are here also did, of the highlights of those years: the importance of education, the fact that Ireland was more bilingual in 1916 than it is now, the importance of arts and culture as we created this new republic. And that issue of arts and culture were further highlighted by the Taoiseach and by Minister Humphreys yesterday morning. In yesterday's culture session, I couldn't attempt to even begin to summarize the rich discussion on Irish literature and art. But the obvious implications for how education creates space for children and students to experiment with their imagination and to be allowed the space to develop in ways that are far beyond economics and the general good into personal and social areas came out again and again. In the session on economics yesterday afternoon, Alan Barrett talked about the concept of cherishing the children of the nation equally. And it is clear that whatever has happened since 1916, the current economic situation, and indeed the various waves that led up to it, are not cherishing our children. And by that he didn't mean the proclamation view of the children, but the young children of the nation, and he raised important issues about health and education. And Mary Corcoran also in that session talked a great deal about tolerance, respect, diversity, and trust, themes which are going to be picked up this morning by our various speakers. An issue was raised about dissociative policy mindset, and we didn't explore that yesterday, but I took that to mean that really the kind of policy making in this country is somehow dissociated from the ideals and objectives which are enunciated by the political situation, by politicians. And then the issue of human development, essential to happiness, health and wealth, were also those issues were also raised. So today, I would like to take up where that session left off yesterday afternoon. It left off with the comment that in creating the new republic, we've only just begun. And my thesis this morning, and I know it's going to be taken up by all of our speakers, is that more than ever this week, the challenges for education policy and for creating a system that will encourage tolerance and diversity have become harder and more acute than ever. In fact, I would put it to you that the discussion on Yeats we've heard a great deal with in various mentions of Yeats. It's not about Easter 1916, it's about his other dystopian views, which he was commenting on in his responses to the political situation in 1930. His widening gyres, the falcon cannot hear the falconer, that in fact perhaps is closer to our own feelings this morning. I'm going to give you a quote from a well-known and highly respected alumnus of this university, quoted by Tom Boland in his discussion about education in the Academy last Wednesday evening. President Higgins has said, "To navigate successfully through today's troubled, uncertain, and probably uncharted waters, now more than ever before, we need visionary foresight and bold strategies. Now more than ever, an original and confident education system is needed to help us achieve our social and economic objectives and to place us on a sustainable footing." He made that speech during his acceptance of the honorary degree from NUI in 2012. So today, the challenge is, in my view, to educate our children to rise above the issues that threaten to drag us down, to face the challenge of technology, which risks, inter alia, reducing attention span, substituting information for knowledge, and allowing sleaze to rise to the surface and the forefront of every debate. We have a challenge in this country of multiculturalism. Ireland's record here is very good. Our respect for diversity is quite strong. And indeed, Ireland has absorbed, over the last 10 years, more immigrants per head of the population than most EU countries. Nonetheless, challenges are there for us to develop those policies to continue to do that. There is the challenge of creating spaces in our institutes of education at all levels and in our media where civilized, respectful debate based on evidence and on expertise is the norm, and where, to quote G.M. Trevelyan, disinterested intellectual curiosity is the lifeblood of real civilization. So, to address these challenges this morning, we are very fortunate to have with us Professor Louise Richardson, and indeed 4 other respondents, whom I will introduce in due course as each of them comes forward. But I wish to introduce Louise Richardson to you. She, as you know, became the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Oxford on the 1st of January 2016, having previously served as the Principal of St. Andrews University. Professor Richardson studied history in Trinity College Dublin, went to get her PhD in Harvard, and has occupied many distinguished roles in Council of Economic Advisors in Scotland, the Carnegie Corporation, inter alia. Professor Richardson is a political scientist. She is recognized as one of the world's experts on counterterrorism. And to address the issue of education and the challenges of education in the 21st century, I invite Professor Richardson. Thank you.
Good morning. The title for my talk was The Role of Education in Addressing the Challenges of the 21st Century. And in thinking about this, I realized immediately that my title was way too ambitious. There are a great many challenges in the 21st century, and most of them, I think, are likely to be revealed as the century progresses. My expertise, such as it is limited to university education, and that will be my focus this morning. A more accurate title, therefore, might have been The Role of Universities in Addressing Some of the Challenges Evident at the Beginning of the 21st Century. So what are these challenges? My list is by no means exhaustive, but I would suggest political violence, inequality, climate change, globalization, and technological change, and I will focus on the first two. I might have given a different emphasis had I written this talk after, not before last Tuesday. It's perhaps worth noting that each of these challenges transcend national borders. But from the vantage point of 1916, these challenges looked very different. The priority then was political violence. As Europe was subsumed in an orgy of mass slaughter, as European powers fought for dominance. From the vantage point of 2116, I expect the priority will be climate change. I predict that our successors will look back on us today and wonder how we could have sat on our hands while evidence of the calamitous consequences of climate change mounted monthly. In 1916, the political leaders in London were preoccupied by political violence, engaged as they were in the war to end all wars. 2 years after the start of the war, and months before the slaughter of the Somme, the Allies had already lost several 100,000 men. The savage costs of the war greatly exceeded their expectations. They perceived the Easter Rising as a treacherous stab in the back of a nation fighting for its very survival against Germany. They had more pressing demands upon their attention than the social inequality rampant across Britain. The leaders of the Rising in Dublin were interested in establishing rather than transcending national borders. They had a very different perspective on political violence. Perceiving Britain's difficulty as Ireland's opportunity, they saw their attempt at political violence as a noble means of securing Irish freedom, succeeding where 6 previous attempts had failed. Now, some followers of James Connolly were motivated by a desire to address social inequality in Dublin, but for most, the commitment to equality was more abstract. The Declaration of Independence spoke of cherishing all the children of the nation equally, of equal rights and equal opportunities to all citizens, and of suffrages for all her men and women. But the priority was physical force to achieve Irish freedom, the right of the people of Ireland to the ownership of Ireland and to the unfettered control of Irish destinies, to be sovereign and indefeasible. They sought equality for the Irish nation among the recognised governments of the world, rather than social equality for the Irish population. Like most revolutionaries, they were vague on what precisely this freedom would entail. I expect that the vast majority of the population of both England and Ireland were primarily concerned, then as now, with their own and their families' security and well-being. While late 19th century advances in transportation and telecommunications had increased trade and cultural diffusion among especially Western nations, the term globalization was unknown in 1916 and was certainly not considered a threat or even a challenge. Indeed, many in Britain, influenced by Norman Angel's The Grand Illusion, naively thought increased trade across Europe made a world war impossible. Angel's argument was that economic interdependence made war futile, which was a much more plausible claim. In 2016, we are witnessing a popular revolt against globalization. Electorates across Europe and America, mobilized by populist and often unscrupulous politicians, are voting against the proponents of globalization, insisting that they are losing their jobs and livelihoods as a result either of outsourcing to countries with lower labor costs or to importation of immigrants willing to accept lower wages. Support for Brexit in Britain and for Trump in the US are only two of the most visible exemplars of this trend. It is impossible to foresee the vantage point of 2116, but it is hard to imagine that the clock can be turned back on globalization. We can only hope that governments, and indeed universities, will make more concerted efforts to ensure that the benefits of globalization are more broadly distributed and understood. Technological change is a constant. Warfare has long served as a catalyst for technological innovation. The 1914-18 war witnessed a transformation in weaponry with the introduction of tanks, machine guns, poison gas, submarines, flamethrowers, and even air reconnaissance. The transport of troops by railway also transformed the conduct of war, and the vast scale of the casualties, estimated at an unimaginable 38 million, was in part due to the introduction of these military innovations and delays in adapting defensive tactics. The pace of technological change has accelerated as the century has progressed, and we can only imagine that it will continue to do so into the future, to the point where it's hard to imagine how a gathering such as this might be conducted, and how, if at all, we might all travel here in 2116. So having briefly sketched the challenges, I'll address the challenges I'm going to address. Let me now turn to the question of education and universities in particular. At a time when only a tiny percentage of the population were university educated, 3 of the 7 signatories of the Declaration of Independence were university graduates: Pádraig Pearse, Joseph Mary Plunkett, and Tomás MacDonagh. All 3 were teachers in the school founded by Pearse and MacDonagh, St. Enda's. 2 other teachers in the school, William Pearse and Con Colbert, were also among those executed in the wake of the Rising. Pearse cared passionately about education and founded St. Enda's in 1908. The school was bilingual, with an unashamedly Celtic and nationalist ethos, teaching valour and heroism refracted through a fascination with mythology. But Pearse was also influenced by the philosophy of Maria Montessori and sought to create a child-centred environment focused on personal development, creativity, imagination, and intellectual freedom. Drawing on the ancient Celtic tradition of fostering, he saw the role of teachers as fostering the personal development of each individual child. These were radical ideas at the time. In his 1915 polemic, The Murder Machine, he railed against the Irish teaching system, which he argued perceived and practiced education as a manufacturing process. He wrote, "Our common parlance has been impressed with the conception of education as some sort of manufacturing process. Our children are raw materials. We desiderate for their education modern methods, which must be efficient but cheap. We send them to Congos to be finished. When finished, they are turned out. Specialists grind them for English civil service and the so-called liberal professions." Ever the visionary, he sought to replace this system with one inspired by ancient Celtic traditions, literature, and heroic legends that would develop a generation of gallant, Gaelic-speaking individuals to fight for the new Ireland. Few proponents of political violence have been as vocal on the subject of education as Pearse. Most are more focused on the evils of the adversary and the tactics required to prevail against them. It's nevertheless difficult to escape the comparison with latter-day madrasas. The educational philosophy of St. Enda's, with its focus on the individual development of the child, could hardly be more different from the harsh discipline and rote learning of the madrasas, producing graduates unschooled in any of the skills required for success in the modern world. Where St. Enda's attracted the children of the Dublin middle and professional classes, madrasas often attract the children of families who can ill afford to feed, much less educate them. Nevertheless, the idea of inculcating the next generation in the ideology of those wishing to overthrow the state and revert to an earlier mythical and halcyon past is a shared feature. What then of the relationship between education or universities and political violence? I think it fair to assume that political violence will remain a challenge for the 21st century. As an educator and one who has spent my career trying to understand the motives of those who resort to terrorism, it is very tempting to see education, and universities in particular, as the antidote to terrorism. By terrorism here, I mean simply the deliberate targeting of non-combatants for a political purpose by a subset group. But if only it were that simple. When I had time to study terrorists, I discovered that one attribute they invariably shared was a highly oversimplified view of the world. They tend to see the world in Manichaean terms, black and white, good and evil. It goes without saying that they see themselves as the good guys and their opponents as evil. Now, I find it very difficult to reconcile this worldview with an education that teaches you to think critically, to question arguments and assumptions, and to look always for the grey. I see the role of education as being in part to rob students of their certitudes. And certitude is a requirement of those willing to sacrifice their lives and commit atrocities that violate every religious and ethical code in pursuit of a goal they are unlikely to achieve. University education is in many ways antithetical to military training. Where universities train students to question, military training teaches obedience. Where universities require consideration, the military requires action. Most importantly, where universities, and especially the humanities, endeavour to inculcate empathy, military action, whether by conventional armies, guerrilla insurgents, or terrorists, requires the dehumanizing of the adversary as a prerequisite for killing them. The British government in 2015 passed into law the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act, which introduced a new statutory duty for universities to have due regard to the need to prevent individuals from being drawn into terrorism. This means that British universities are now obliged to engage with what's called the PREVENT agenda. The two aspects of this legislation that are of most concern to universities are the obligation to report to the authorities those seen as vulnerable to radicalization, and the infringement of freedom of speech entailed in the prohibition of the expression of extremist, including non-violent extremist speech. The legislation arose from an understandable concern about the radicalization of young people. While not ostensibly focused on any particular group, there is no doubt in anyone's mind that the target, in fact, is Islamic extremism. Universities have two concerns. If Muslim students fear being reported to the authorities, they are less likely to avail themselves of the support facilities available at universities. Moreover, they are more likely to feel suspect and unwelcome, and hence less likely to integrate into university life. An even bigger concern is the threat to the freedom of expression, which is the hallmark of every university worthy of the name. An amendment to the legislation attached in the Lords allowed universities to have particular regard to our obligation to defend free speech, which provides some protection against the more draconian aspects of the original bill. Nevertheless, with annual reporting to HEFCE on the measures being taken to ensure extremist speech is not expressed at universities, there is necessarily a chilling effect on free speech. My own view is that universities should welcome the expression of all legal speech. It is precisely at universities where such speech can be openly challenged. As teachers, I think we have an obligation to model to our students how to respond to speech they find objectionable. We should do so in a spirit of what my colleague Timothy Garton-Ash calls robust civility. Extremist speech is vaguely defined in legislation as speech expressing vocal or active opposition to British values. I would think that British values are sufficiently robust to withstand such criticism, and indeed that it is a core British value to respect the right to criticise the powers that be. It's true, of course, that some terrorists have been radicalised while at university, though given the demographic of the university population, it would be astonishing if they were not. The Centre for Social Cohesion claims that 30% of individuals involved in Islamic-inspired terrorist attacks in the UK have attended British universities or third-level colleges. The iron law of social science, of course, is that correlation does not imply causation. It does not follow that they were radicalised at university. We have no way of knowing how many young people went to university with radical ideas that were changed by their education. Cases that are cited are King's College London graduates Asif Hanif and Omar Khan Sharif, who carried out a suicide bomb attack in Tel Aviv in 2003, or Abdullah Ahmed Ali, who participated in the plot to carry out a liquid bomb attack on transatlantic flights in 2007. He attended London City University. Another example was Kafil Ahmed, a member of the Islamic Society at Queen's in Belfast, who died trying to detonate an explosive device outside Glasgow Airport. I've seen no evidence to suggest that they were radicalised at university. Young men, by and large, carry out terrorist attacks. There are lots of young men at university. Prisons which hold large numbers of young men are infinitely more effective breeding grounds for terrorists. Two cases in which terrorists claim to have been radicalized at university are Umar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib, variously known as the Christmas or Underpants bomber, who is said to have been radicalized at UCL, where he was president of the Islamic Society. He studied in Yemen both before and after his time in UCL. So it's reasonable to assume that at least part of his radicalization had taken place there. He was sentenced to life in prison for trying to blow up a Detroit-bound airliner on Christmas Day 2009. His parents were belatedly aware of his radicalization and went to considerable lengths to stop it. Another well-known case is that of Omar Sheikh, who was convicted of the brutal murder of Daniel Pearl. He wrote in his confession that while a student at the London School of Economics in 1992, Bosnia Week was observed, and a number of documentary films were shown. He wrote that one film in particular, The Death of a Nation, which depicted Bosnian Muslims being murdered by Serbs, shook my heart and launched his political awakening and subsequent radicalization. He helped to organize a student conference on Bosnia and then began fundraising for a convoy of materials for Bosnia. Soon he was making contact with Islamic militants. It's hard for me to see how the LSE can be held accountable for his radicalization. We don't know how many other students participated in the same activities, watched the same films, even contributed to relief materials without being radicalized. While I would insist that universities cannot be blamed for radicalization of their students, it is the case that many terrorists are, in fact, highly educated. In terrorist organizations, as in most others, the leaders tend to be different from the followers. They often, for example, come from higher educational and socioeconomic backgrounds. The leader not only arranges training, but provides an ideology, identifies the enemy, articulates a strategy. In some cases, leaders become the personification of the group or ideology. Some leaders have become almost godlike status amongst their followers, such as Osama bin Laden of Al-Qaeda, Vellupillai Prabhakaran of the Sri Lankan Tamil Tigers, and Shoko Asahara of the Japanese group Aum Shinrikyo, known amongst other things for the unusually high educational attainment of its members. During his trial, one of the chemists of Aum Shinrikyo was asked why he had left his position in the University of Tokyo to join Aum Shinrikyo, and he said because the laboratory facilities were infinitely better. Some organizations create a cult of personality around their leaders, such as Abail Guzman of the Peruvian Shining Path and Abdullah Öcalan of the Turkish PKK. Leaders of terrorist movements tend to be older and more highly educated than their followers, no matter what part of the world they come from. In Latin America, while the longtime leader of the FARC, Manuel Marulanda Vélez, was not thought to have been highly educated, Brazil's Carlos Maragrea was a civil engineering dropout. Raul Sendek, leader of the Uruguayan Tupamaros, was a lawyer. Mario Roberto Santucho, leader of the Argentine ERP, was an economist. And Guzman was a professor of anthropology. In Europe, most of the leaders of the Italian Red Brigades were university professors. Most of the members of the Baader-Meinhof group in Germany were university dropouts. Abdullah Öcalan of the PKK had studied law and political science. Today, Islamic groups appear to recruit successfully from all sectors of society. Bin Laden, a multimillionaire, studied economics. His second in command, Ayman al-Zawahiri, is a doctor, as was George Habash, the leader of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and Abdul Aziz Rantisi, one of the founders of Hamas. Mohammed Atta, the leader of the 9/11 team, earned a PhD in urban planning. Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, the spiritual leader of Hamas, trained as a teacher, while Yasser Arafat is an engineer. And I should offer apologies now to any engineers in the audience, especially President. Mark Sageman studied the biographies of 171 members of Al-Qaeda and found that 2/3 of them were middle or upper class, and that 60% had attended university while several had doctorates. Similarly, Gilles Capel studied 300 Islamic militants in Egypt and found that they too were more highly educated and of higher socioeconomic status than most terrorists. Peter Bergen's examination of the background of 75 terrorists responsible for some of the most damaging attacks found that 53% had doctorates from Western University and 2 others were working on PhDs. While every terrorist group needs foot soldiers as cannon fodder, Islamist groups have successfully recruited a cadre of highly educated followers. Men such as Omar Sheikh and Mohammed Atta are required for the kind of international operation that necessitate international travel and operating in different cultures and countries. Moreover, increased reliance on the internet for secure transnational communications requires operatives with some technological facility. Universities then do not cause radicalization, but nor has university education prevented individuals from becoming terrorists. Recent empirical work by Diego Gambetta and Stefan Herzog has shed a fascinating new light on a more nuanced relationship between university education and, in particular, courses of study and terrorism. And this is where the engineers might want to leave. Ever since Ted Kerr's seminal book, Why Men Rebel, was published in 1970, we have known about the power of relative deprivation. This is the view that it's not one's objective condition, but rather one's relative condition that incites rebellion. The Peruvian Shining Path would be a case in point. The government introduced universities into the remote region of Ayacucho to bring education to the indigenous population. They received the education and emerged with heightened expectations into an economy that could not employ them. They were then easily radicalized by Abel Guzman, offering both a Maoist explanation for their predicament and a means to redress it. Gambetta and Herzog have focused on contemporary Islamic extremists, and while their findings need to be treated with caution, as the numbers are low and accurate information hard to attain, their findings provide empirical support for claims long felt intuitive, namely that particular types of terrorist groups tend to recruit people from particular educational backgrounds. They too find some support for the motivating power of a sense of relative deprivation, which they find consistent with the growth and decline of various professions, engineers, doctors, teachers, and lawyers, in opposition movements in Islamic countries over the course of a century. They found very few graduates in extremist groups in countries with good labor market opportunities. Medicine and engineering are 2 subjects with the highest status and highest entry requirements across the Islamic world. They found that engineers were prominent in Islamic radicalism in the 1970s in countries undergoing economic crises, but not earlier. They also found that there were very few engineers in Islamist movements in Saudi Arabia, where there were very good labor market opportunities. They found that the core of the Islamic movement emerged from would-be elites, not the poor and dispossessed. They demonstrated that university graduates are overrepresented among Islamic radicals, and that the higher the level of education, the greater the likelihood of joining a violent group, and that those with the most demanding degrees, like engineering and medicine, have a greater likelihood of joining. They found that across groups and countries, relative to the male population, the number of engineers in extremist groups is 14 times what you would expect, relative to other university graduates. They found that engineers radicalize in the Islamic world partly as a result of acute relative deprivation, but that they radicalize disproportionately even in the absence of frustrated ambitions, as shown by their presence in South Asia and Western-based Islamist groups. In short, engineers prefer to join violent rather than peaceful Islamist opposition groups. Doctors are better represented than engineers amongst non-violent Islamists. Unlike them, when given the choice, doctors opt for secular groups, whereas engineers prefer to join religious rather than secular or nationalist groups. Engineers who do join radical groups do so with special intensity and devotion, with a particular bias for religious extremism. They are more committed and less likely to defect when they join. In fact, the odds of an engineer defecting are 40% of what one would expect given their numbers. There are lots of similarities between Islamist groups and violent right-wing groups. and they are very different from left-wing groups. Radical right-wing movements aim for ethnic and cultural purification. Islamists aim for religious purification. Both aim for purity of social mores and share social conservatism. They tend to share a nostalgia for a lost past, a focus on tradition, and an obsession with order, hierarchy, and strong identity boundaries. Left-wing groups are very different, and while engineers are frequently found among right-wing and extremist groups in the developed world, they rarely join left-wing groups. One argument would be that recruiters want engineers because of their practical skills, but this is not consistent with the evidence. Groups in which members are selected by recruiters have fewer engineers than groups where they are self-selected. And besides, left-wing groups, who also need practical engineering skills, rarely get them. In stark contrast, humanities and social science graduates are strongly represented in left-wing groups, but almost entirely absent from right-wing and Islamist ones. Moreover, the odds of a humanities graduate defecting from a group are 14 times greater than you would expect from their numbers. Relative to engineers, the odds of a humanities graduate defecting from their terrorist group is 40 times greater. Doctors, on the other hand, defect in proportion to their presence in the group. It's also perhaps worth pointing out that women are relatively rare in Islamist and right-wing groups and quite common in left-wing groups, and women too are less likely to defect than their male comrades. So what then is the role of universities in addressing the challenge of political violence in the 21st century? As I've attempted to demonstrate, a university degree is no antidote to political violence. But I believe that an education is. As engines of our economies, universities can help to undermine the emergence of the sense of relative deprivation that emerges from the frustrated ambitions of the highly educated into economies that cannot absorb them, deploy their skills, or enable them to realize their ambitions. But if universities focus exclusively on training a skilled workforce, we lose the opportunity to provide an education that is so much broader and more important. An education that produces a generation accustomed to thinking critically, acting ethically, and always questioning, whether it is the doctrines of the government of the day or the ideologies of those wishing to overthrow it. This is a generation that will question those proponents of violence. An education that teaches empathy with others, that exposes its students to a cosmopolitan community of scholars that delights in difference rather than fears it, and that inculcates the belief that truth is an aspiration, not a possession, this is a generation that will reject any effort to impose orthodoxy. As well as engines of the economy, universities have long served as drivers of social mobility. They will need to continue to do so, and to do so with more energy and creativity if we are to redress societal inequality. The centrality of the issue of inequality in Western democracies was captured by the reception accorded Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century. He focused on wealth inequality in the US and Europe since the 18th century, and argued that the rate of return on capital is greater than economic growth over the long term, resulting in a concentration of wealth and social and economic instability. The book reached the #1 slot on the New York Times bestseller list for hardcover nonfiction, and became the greatest ever sales success for Harvard University Press. Clearly, he was onto something, the same something indeed as the Occupy movement. The question of inequality is too broad for consideration here, and the gravest inequality, of course, is between rich and poor countries. My focus is on equality of access to education in countries like ours. By comparison, across Africa, only 6% of the population are university educated, and even there, the variation between countries is significant. Compared to the universities of 1916, today's universities are bigger, their students come from more diverse socioeconomic backgrounds, and are, of course, markedly more female. The transformation of the role of women in Irish universities is captured by the fact that in 1898, women made up 0.8% of medical students matriculating in Irish universities. In 2008, they were 75%. Queen's Belfast was the most progressive of all Irish university colleges and was proud of its record on female education. Queen's admitted women to do honours classes in 1882 and medical classes from 1889. Cork admitted its first female medical students in 1890 and Galway in 1892. When girls were first admitted to study here in Galway in 1888, the local Catholic bishop, F.J. McCormack, was furious and had a declaration forbidding girls to attend the college read aloud in all Catholic churches in the diocese. Ironically, UCD, the college which was seen as being at the centre of the drive for Irish educational equality, was the last institution to hold out against admitting women. It was not until the passage of the National University of Ireland Bill in 1908 that women began to be integrated as full members of the college. Even then, only after the clergy's preferred plan, which was the establishment of separate women's colleges, had not been successful. Curiously, Catholic women made up 9% of the total number of women at Trinity between 1904 and 1924. This is the same percentage of men, and a significant figure given the extent of clerical disapproval. They must have been pretty brave women, as Catholic opinion was firmly anti-Trinity and at best neutral on the issue of university education for women. The pioneers of women's educational movement were mainly middle class, urban and Protestant. Catholic activists only emerged after the first cohort of Catholics had passed through university and could speak for themselves. Until 1879, the only universities in Ireland were Trinity and Queen's, and neither was acceptable to the Catholic hierarchy, so there was little chance that the women's cause would be taken up. A big change occurred in 1878 with the establishment of the intermediate educational system, and in the following year at the Royal University of Ireland. The first was a new system of secondary education open to all students, based exclusively on exam results, and the latter just an examining body based on London University and designed for men to get degrees without having to attend a Protestant institution like Trinity or a non-denominational one like Queen's. These initiatives took place without women in mind, though women were the beneficiaries. This reinforces my view that all one has to do is to create a true meritocracy, and women will do fine. In 1884, 9 women had graduated from the Royal with a degree. By 1909, there were 70. Only 5 women registered at Cork in the first 2 years after admission, but by 1896, there were 30. A real breakthrough occurred in 1896 when 2 women graduated in medicine, thereby shattering the widely held belief that a degree in arts was the pinnacle of women's achievement. While some professors did refuse to teach women, significant advances were made. Alice Perry took a first in engineering in Galway in 1906, becoming the first qualified female engineer in the UK and possibly the world. Remarkably, she was one of 5 sisters who all graduated from Queen's Galway. Progress, however, was slow. I'm told that in the 1950s here in Galway, there was only 1 woman taking maths. She was known not by her given name, but as Honours Maths. Being one of only a few women did have its compensations. Apparently, they were in great demand in college dances. One male recollected that women were so scarce that the men were forced to ration out our dances amongst the men, half a dance to one man and half to another, at the college's annual social. For centuries, universities have deprived themselves of the contribution of half the population by their exclusion of women. Who knows what discoveries might have been made, diseases cured, books, poems, or musical scores written, if women had access to the same education as men. The same applies today to those whose condition of birth, whether they are born into an impoverished or war-torn country, or because they are born into a deprived or dysfunctional family in our own wealthy countries, are denied the benefits of a good education, and society in turn denied their potential contributions. We have to address the societal inequality that means that the children of academics like you and me have a far greater chance of attaining a university education than the children of labourers. In the UK, the wealthiest children are 4 times more likely to go to university than the poorest ones, and 7 times more likely to go to a top university than the poorest children. And the gap even appears to be widening, notwithstanding considerable effort and expense. In the US, a child born into a family with an income in the highest quartile has an 85% chance of earning a university degree. a child born into a family with an income in the lowest quartile has an 8% chance. In Dublin, 4 out of 5 young people from well-off areas go to university. But in the most disadvantaged areas, it is just 1 out of 7.5. According to the OECD, in Ireland, 20% of people whose parents did not finish secondary school attain a third-level education, compared to 69% of those whose parents have a third-level education. These figures are broadly comparable to England's 22% and 73% respectively, and less stark than the US, 13 and 61%. While I see this as morally indefensible, it's also practically damaging, as we are denying ourselves access to the talents of so many people. These are not easy problems to solve. The key to access to a good university education is good early education. Indeed, increasing evidence is becoming available that attendance at preschool significantly improves one's chances of doing well at school later. A recent Oxford study found that children of all socioeconomic backgrounds in the UK who attended preschool were twice as likely as those to attend the sixth form as those who didn't. And this is consistent with American studies on the success of the Head Start preschool program. One of the great tragedies of our wealthy societies today is just how many young people, and in the UK, this cohort is increasingly young white males, working class white males, how many young people are falling off the academic ladder very early on. Universities like mine are constantly being criticized for not accepting more poor kids, and there is certainly more we can do. But the real tragedy is how few kids from deprived backgrounds have the academic skills to be competitive for entry into the most selective universities. Ireland does better than most countries in the proportion of its population achieving third-level education. According to Eurostat, Ireland has the most higher education graduates per head of population of all 27 countries in the European Union. The economic benefits of a university education are easy to calculate. The intangible benefits are incalculable, but even more profound. In the UK, according to the OECD, those with bachelor's degrees earn 49% more than those with a secondary education. In the US, the figure is 60%. In Ireland, the figure is 63%. For those with graduate degrees in the UK, their income is 71% higher than those with a secondary education. In the US, the figure is 122% higher. In Ireland, the figure is 90% more. A report on job creation in the recovery conducted by Georgetown University, job creation in the recovery from the financial crisis, demonstrated that, this is in the US, 99% of job growth went to workers with more than a secondary education. I think this statistic alone can explain the Trump phenomenon. In other words, workers with bachelor's degrees or more have added 8.4 million jobs, compared to workers with a high school diploma who added 80,000 jobs. I believe that the years between now and 2116 will demonstrate a direct correlation between the ability of governments to educate a broader section of society and the degree of social instability experienced by these societies. The last few months have amply demonstrated, most dramatically in the US, but certainly in Britain too, the destabilizing power of an economically disenfranchised population. Universities also have their part to play in addressing the other challenges I mentioned: climate change, globalization, and technological change. They will do so, I believe, by doing what universities do best: dispassionately and creatively conducting research into critical scientific and societal problems, and educating the next generation of students in our methods and conclusions. But we must do more. We must become better in promulgating the results of our research, and we must win the respect of our societies for the integrity of our findings. That an unscrupulous politician's claim that we have had enough of experts can gain resonance is evidence that we have failed to make our case. If our societies are to make the necessary behavioral changes necessary to accommodate climate change, they must be convinced of the reliability of our findings. If we want populations to dismantle rather than erect national borders, we must present incontrovertible evidence of the benefits of globalization. If we want to master new technologies, we must educate not only those with the ability to make scientific discoveries and technological innovation, we must educate a generation with the moral sensitivity to think through the implications of these discoveries and innovations for the rest of society. This is a lot of responsibility to accord to universities, but it was John Stuart Mill, a 19th century advocate of reconciliation with Ireland, the advancement of women, and freedom of the press, who said that the purpose of a university was the laying open to each succeeding generation the accumulated treasures of the thoughts of mankind. Thank you.
Professor Richardson, thank you very much for a very powerful statement about the necessity for freedom of expression, robust civility, and the role of universities in addressing deprivation and as drivers of social mobility. I think, as we have already said, that this, more than ever, gives education for the 21st century a very real mission and purpose. To respond to your paper, I would first, we have some great respondents here this morning, and I would first invite Professor Dympna Devine, who is head of the School of Education in University College Dublin. Professor Devine is a specialist in socio-cultural dynamics across families and schools, and she has published extensively on the issue of access for migrant children, and the implications of multiculturalism for society. And she also focuses greatly in general on social cohesion. So, Professor Devine, thank you.
Good morning, and nice to see everybody here so early on a Saturday morning. And thank you, Professor Richardson, for your paper. Professor Richardson's paper raises wide-ranging issues, and it is difficult to do full justice to them in my response. However, in the time available, I would like to present a sociological critique of education in Ireland, 1916 to 2016, with reference to issues of equality raised by Professor Richardson in her paper. So my focus is on the role of education in society, in shaping the kind of society envisioned by the leaders of 1916, in shaping the very experience of what it means to be a child in Ireland, including up to the present day. We've a long history of recognising the importance of education, going right back to the extraordinary proliferation of the head schools towards the end of the 18th century, and not unrelatedly, being one of the first countries internationally to have a state-funded primary education system from 1831. But recognising the importance of education does not say anything necessarily about what is valued in education, and crucially, what purpose education serves and for whom. For me, this is crucial to framing some of the wider questions raised by Professor Richardson's paper in relation to issues of equality, meritocracy, and opportunity, as these are played out in the field of education. Pearse, as Professor Richardson notes, had very distinct views on the importance of education as a cornerstone for cultural and Gaelic revival, which did indeed become the hallmark of the education system in the early years of the new state. The focus, however, was not on a social revolution that placed issues of equality and the welfare of children at its core. Indeed, children were perceived primarily as cultural products in the making, to be moulded in line with a particular kind of Irish imaginary. The new state did little to acknowledge the diversity of childhoods or the everyday realities of children in poverty and at the margins. For the next 30 years, the state's perception of its role, vision, or lack of it is best personified by Mulcahy, Minister for Education in 1950, when he described himself as a kind of dungarees man who could be expected to take the knock out of the pipes and link up everything. And he went on to say, whatever the functions of the state was, it had no power to interfere with the rights of parents or with the authority of the church in education. It was only when Irish society began to turn outwards towards the middle of the 20th century, gearing itself for an intensive process of modernisation, that recognition was given to the value of education for wider social and economic development. This human capital perspective, inspired by outside expert voices in the OECD, mirrored back to senior policymakers in the Investment in Education report in 1967, the gross inequalities within the Irish education system. At that time, for example, only 10% of 15 to 19-year-olds from semi- and unskilled manual backgrounds were attending full-time education, in contrast to over 50% of those from the professional and managerial classes. The OECD report heralded the introduction of free secondary school education, of community schools at second level, the abandonment of the primary school certificate, and the gradual introduction of more child-centred pedagogies at primary level. It's certainly true that this project of modernisation opened up opportunities in education, equality of access, as Professor Richardson noted. Participation rates in education substantively increased and continued to grow over the following decades, giving rise to school completion rates of up to 91% in 2015. But equality of access to education is the minimal expectation we must surely have for our children and young people in the 21st century, where it is not whether you have an education that counts, but at what level you have it. A key issue is the equal chance to participate and achieve once inside the school door. Our high participation and completion rates in education do not reflect the variation we have in achievement across different social groups. Social class differences are strongly reflected in performance in the junior and leaving certificates and in the transfer of students to higher education. This suggests that something is going on within and between our schools that is not providing every child with an equal chance to succeed. If time allowed, I could speak further about differences in culture and ethos across schools, in teacher expectations and capacities to cater for an increasingly diverse student cohort, in the intensification of teaching and learning in an exam system that rewards product over process, in the laddish culture that can permeate some working class boys' schools, and so on. But the impact of social class is noteworthy, even by international standards. Professor Richardson pointed to the substantial rates of graduates coming through the higher education system in Ireland. This is something to be rightly proud of, a direct outcome from the changes made in educational policy in the 1960s. Yet she also hints at the underlying class inequalities in our system, the different transfer rates by postcode in Dublin that is borne out by national research. OECD studies comparing the performance of 15-year-olds confirm real underlying social class inequities in the Irish education system, especially when compared with other similar-sized countries. Their research suggests that the more segregation within an education system, the less well the system overall will do, and this very much ties into Professor Richardson's comments on relative deprivation. Finland is often taken as a key exemplar, but also as a good comparator for Ireland because of its size, history, and population. Interestingly, the Finnish example is telling because over a 30-year period, they strategically worked to reduce social class differences and prioritised equality as a key goal underpinning the purpose of their education system. By contrast, in Ireland, we have a relatively segregated education system that separates many children on the basis of gender, social class, faith, and while still in a relatively early phase, increasingly ethnic and migrant background. This results in significant differences across schools in learning culture and performance, and ultimately in patterns of dropout and/or transfer to higher education. These patterns are becoming more pronounced as competitive dynamics in an increasingly market-oriented system unfold, crystallised in the annual hype of the Leaving Certificate, a points race that is ironically positioned as fair, and the publication of school league tables by the national media that simplify truths on good schools devoid of socioeconomic analysis. Professor Richardson speaks also of social inequalities in education as morally indefensible and a loss of potential and talent in the system. I would go further and suggest they are an infringement of children's right to respect, dignity, and the opportunity to flourish in their present lives as children, as well as their future lives as adults. The structural inequalities in Irish education must be understood against a backdrop of the relative underinvestment in education historically in Ireland, and underinvestment in services that directly affect children. Our record with respect to childhood inequalities is not good and worsened with the economic crisis. A report by UNICEF in 2014 of the economic crisis in rich countries confirmed that Ireland ranked 37 out of 41 countries in the level of child poverty increase between 2008 and 2012. Of all vulnerable groups, it was children who experienced the most severe burden during the financial crisis. In addition, the overall burden of national debt will be carried by this same younger generation into their lifetimes and that of their children. Yet the social transfers to them, including through education, has declined to a much greater extent than to other groups. Even during the boom years, the proportionate spending on education relative to GDP was low by international standards and only began to increase towards the last years of the boom. Significantly, investment in the education of our youngest citizens, children in the early years and primary school, continues to be lowest across all sectors of education. Crises in funding for the higher education sector are also to the fore. These patterns cannot be divorced from the patterns established at the foundation of the state and the inadequate recognition of education as vital to the national interest, rather than as a matter of private choice and personal gain. Irish society is today going through profound change socially, economically, culturally. Our school population now comprises 12% of children and young people who are of migrant background, keen to embrace what Ireland has to offer, ambitious and resilient, often in the face of difficult and challenging personal circumstances. Core questions arise around belonging, identity, cohesion, solidarity, and the underlying vision and values that guide national policy making in an era of uncertainty and insecurity. Professor Richardson refers to the key role of universities in contributing to social stability at times of change. I agree wholeheartedly and extend this analysis to education in its totality. Education is a public good. Research is clear that societies that prioritise the rights and well-being of all children and young people as a core principle are societies that do best economically and socially. This happens when a coherent, integrated vision is brought to the provision of services to children through the education system, from primary to upper secondary. Economically, this also makes sense. If you want to tackle health expenditure, you do it by investing in education and in the well-being of children from birth. If you want to reduce criminality, you invest in children's learning and development, working in tandem with and supporting their families and wider community. Ultimately, it is the wider choices we make about the type of society we wish to live in that influences the type of education system we have. Our vision of a good society influences what we define as worthwhile and good in education, as well as what is good in childhood. The challenges facing us as a society are great. We have the capacity to be and do better. We have a growing child population, unusual in a Europe of ageing societies. This is a great plus. If we plan carefully and with a long-term vision about how best to invest the resources we have, we can use this period as one of opportunity and rejuvenation. Building a vision that is based on values of fairness, inclusion, care, empathy, and high expectations for all is essential. Pluralism, democracy, equality, citizenship are all referred to by Professor Richardson, and I agree that these are fundamental to how we should define and frame a fit-for-purpose education system for the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dimna. That was a terrific start to our conversation, and I particularly welcome the fact that you raised the issue of investment. Our next respondent is Professor Fionnuala Walden. He's chair of the Centre for Human Rights and Citizenship and Professor of Education at DCU Institutes of Education, which is the grouping and merging, coming together of a number of institutes of teacher education. She no doubt will mention this herself. Her areas of interest include global citizenship, education, climate change, and the teaching of history.
Good morning, and it's wonderful to have the opportunity here today to respond to Professor Richardson's paper, and where she identified a range of challenges that are facing us in the current century. It is indeed becoming increasingly evident that we are living in an age of unprecedented chaos and turmoil, where each day brings fresh challenges to how we see ourselves and our place in the world, where questions of evidence and expertise are recast as opinion and vested interests, where distrust and alienation are sustained and nurtured by endemic local and global inequalities, where climate change is already undermining the livelihoods of those least able to meet its challenges and with least culpability in its unfolding, and where politics itself seems fragile in the face of growing xenophobia and racism. In thinking about the future, there seems little doubt that this century will see an increase in problems of global inequality and conflict, tied to a continued and exponential acceleration of environmental degradation and climate change, and Professor Richardson addressed many of these issues in her paper. In this context, it is easy to be pessimistic and difficult to be hopeful. Yet, as Paulo Freire argues in his final publication, The Pedagogy of Indignation, to be an educator without hope contradicts the natural character of education. And while the future seems bleaker than usual at the moment, Freire reminds us that nothing is determined. We are unfinished beings in an unfinished world with an ethical responsibility to intervene, to transform, to insert ourselves in a permanent process of hope-filled search. And education is that process. So building now on the responses of Professor Devine to Professor Richardson's paper, I would like to look at how education can enable children to deal with the uncertainties and challenges of the future, with particular emphasis on education for democracy and climate change education. So my focus is on child education, and particularly the context of in the Irish primary context. And what I'm going to say is informed by the following perspective on children, on their learning and on their place in the world. And that is the idea of children as active constructors of knowledge, as agentic in their engagement with the world, as capable and competent actors with rights of participation and decision-making, My comments are also premised on the view, supported by the literature, that children's capacities to engage with difficult and complex knowledge are underestimated, and that our approaches to teaching and learning should imagine children in ways that respect and enable their agency, their capacity to act in and on the world, and that build their resilience in the face of adversity, their sense of purpose, their capacity to question, to problem pose as well as problem solve. To a large extent, this is the view of children and of education embodied in the Irish primary curriculum. Premised on a child-centred approach which embraces a commitment to the social construction of knowledge and to active and participatory pedagogies, it prioritises communication, problem-solving, critical thinking, multi-perspectivity and respect for different others. While it has some limitations, it is, I believe, an enabling and empowering curriculum which offers many opportunities to engage deeply with these challenging times where the idea of democracy itself seems under threat. 2016 is also the centenary of the publication of John Dewey's Democracy and Education. Dewey's influence on child education in Ireland is multifaceted, but in the context of today's discussion, perhaps his commitment to education in, through and for democracy is the most pertinent. For Dewey, children's exposure to the practice of democracy as lived experience in the present was the best guarantee of a democratic future. In particular, his conceptualization of democracy as a mode of associated living suggests that democratic structures, processes and relations should permeate all aspects of school life, providing opportunities for democratic engagement, active participation, discussion and deliberation. And contemporaneous with Dewey, children's democratic participation in education also formed part of Pearce's educational vision. Professor Richardson addressed the complex educational legacy of Pearce. I'd just like to focus in on one aspect of that. In his in-depth study of Pearce's educational work, the historian Brendan Walsh locates Pearce within a radical tradition of education as a form of resistance, foreshadowing many of the characteristics of radical educators in the late 20th century. Noting, among other things, Pearce's commitment to student empowerment and democratic participation through the establishment of the Student Council, attempting to create in microcosm at the Boy Republic of St. Enda's what he hoped would characterise an independent Ireland. Yet, as we mark both centenaries and almost decades after the Convention on the Rights of the Child championed the rights of children to have a voice in matters that concern them, democratic structures, including student councils, are still not embedded in the Irish education system. The Education Act 1998 allows for, but does not require, student councils at second level, while primary schools have, very few primary schools have established student councils. Student councils at second level have been strongly critiqued as largely tokenistic and functionally redundant. Those words are taken from Fleming 2015. Fleming's stringent critique builds on earlier studies, which identify the extent to which student voice is subordinated to adult control, limited by discourses of power and authority embedded in school roles, reduced to discussion and decision-making on marginal issues, and circumscribed by the pressures exerted by curriculum and assessment. It would be wrong to think that there have been no gains in terms of children's participation in an education context. Their routine involvement in curriculum consultation by the NCCA, for example, the prioritisation of listening to and involving children and young people as one of the 6 goals of the National Policy Framework for Children and Young People, the commitment to student councils at primary level as part of that framework, the launch in June of a national strategy on children and young people's participation in decision-making. Yet moving practice into the space of authentic participation remains a real challenge. Democratising practice in schools and classrooms includes, but cannot be reduced to, children participating in the decision-making structures of the school at all levels, and, to use Laura Lundy's insightful frame developed in relation to children's participation rights, ensuring that their views are given space, voice, audience and influence. It also suggests modes of teaching that are participative and dialogical, that engage students in deliberation on important issues, that provide opportunities for students to contest and disagree, that challenges them to listen to and engage with divergent views, and prompts them to interrogate their own positionality and to engage critically with all forms of media. All of these are essential components of that second challenge that I want to address very briefly here, that of climate change education. Earlier this year, and shortly after the Minister announced the introduction of coding at primary level, I became aware of a cartoon which was doing the rounds on social media. Published by the Joy of Tech website, it shows a teacher in front of a class who announces with great enthusiasm that children, today we are going to learn to code. It's important for a prosperous future. At which point one of the children responds, "Teacher, after that, could we learn how to survive in a civilization threatened by ecosystem collapse, rising sea levels, and the resulting geopolitical turmoil, armed conflict, and the increasing polarization of ideological orientations, and humanity's seemingly insatiable appetite for stuff?" I'm not seeking to set up a false opposition here, and the computational and critical thinking inherent in the application of coding will indeed support the kind of technological innovation that will necessarily form part of the response to climate change. Yet the cartoon captures succinctly the need to rethink our national priorities in education, to get back to that deeper vision outlined by Professor Richardson and by Professor Devine, to prioritise the deeper capabilities, values and dispositions that are critical to children's future capacities to meet the political, social, emotional and ideological challenges ahead. The capacity to move beyond self-interest, to look beyond ourselves individually and nationally, and act in solidarity with people who are not like us, to recognise our shared humanity and believe in the equal worth and dignity of all people. In the words of Martha Nussbaum, the capacity to see themselves as not simply citizens of some local region or group, but also and above all as human beings bound to other human beings by ties of recognition. The idea that climate change education should be a national priority for the 21st century should be self-evident. Yet, subsumed under education for sustainable development in national strategies here and elsewhere, it tends to fall prey to what Selby and Kagawa term a rear-view mirror curricular approach, focused on the questions, problems and responses of the 1980s and 90s, such as whether or not climate change is actually happening, rather than imagining possible futures, challenging taken for granted assumptions about growth, the sufficiency of an individualized turn-off-the-lights approach to action, and the morality of rampant consumerism. As Selby and Kagawa argue, what is needed is an approach that is not afraid to shine light in dark places, that interrogates the ideological and economic drivers of climate change and enables children to understand issues of culpability and responsibility in relation to climate justice, including issues of migration and conflict, that promotes systems-level thinking and collective action. It needs to enable children to deal with uncertainty and ambiguity, to understand that all things are connected, and to reconnect with place and with the wonder, beauty and value of the natural world. In short, as Pestalozzi argued, an education that connects with the heart, head and hands. Professor Richardson spoke about the need for education that ensured that children and young people were capable of thinking critically, acting ethically, and always questioning. With that in mind, and in the absence of the reprioritization I've spoken about, we need to maximize the small spaces that exist and the new ones that are emerging, such as that promised by the introduction of ethics and ERB into the primary curriculum. I began by drawing on Paulo Freire, and I would like to return to him at the end. Freire was not afraid to shine light in those dark places, but he also recognized that the smallest spaces can be sites of possibility, and the obligation and responsibility on educators to do what is historically possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fionnuala, and for your emphasis both on democracy and on finding these spaces and for the climate change issue. Now ask Willie Donnelly to come and talk to us. Professor Donnelly is the president of Waterford Institute of Technology. He is founder of the Telecommunications Software System Group. His research is all to do with technology responses, next generation networks, smart agriculture. He is the founder of a network of mobile services companies in the southeast of Ireland, which employs more than 1,000 people. And I think he's probably uniquely positioned to address the issue, the technological issue that has been already raised this morning. Professor Donnelly.
I'm delighted to have this opportunity to respond to Professor Richardson's paper. I took particular note of her comments on engineers, being an engineer and having spent 20 years trying to radicalize engineers into new ideas. I understand the challenge there. I would like to focus on globalization and the impact of globalization on our educational system and on policy in general. The Rising in 1916 was not just a battle for political independence, but also for economic and social independence. The founding fathers proposed a model for economic independence. There was an idealized model based on the nationalist movement, the land wars of the 1880s, that Ireland would prosper by promoting the interests of small farmers and of the native industry serving the local economies. By the time we got to the 50th anniversary of the Rising, the state had abandoned this idealized view. And in the 60s, the Industrial Development Authority refocused on high technology and foreign direct investment. At that phase, it was mainly on manufacturing. But a key part of this refocus was the reform of the higher educational system. That reform included the establishment of the regional technical colleges, which Waterford Institute was part of, and also of the National Institutes of Higher Education, which now is UL and DCU. There was a clear prioritisation of investment in science and technology subjects on a vocational training of students to meet the needs of industry. And I would propose that we still have that mindset today. Today, we're going through a new revolution. It's sometimes called the Fourth Industrial Revolution. In the 21st century, this revolution is characterized by the digital revolution, which is driven by the internet. The digital revolution is directly challenging traditional models of political and economic organization. Now, this disruption is best exemplified by the emergence of the electronic currency system, Bitcoin. Bitcoin is an innovative payment network and a new kind of money. Bitcoin uses peer-to-peer technology. It exists independent of any national state and is not managed through the central bank. Now, considering our experience with banking, we may celebrate that. But if you consider this, that today globally, the economy is driven by the interventions of banks, central banks, the Fed. Imagine a system where the economic currencies are not controlled by the banks, and the impact that's going to have on the future development of society. A second example is Uber. Uber is a peer-to-peer taxi application service. There have been protests staged in Germany, Spain, France, and the United Kingdom, among other nations, against the introduction of Uber because of questions of employment law, consumer protection, unfair commercial practices, tax law, and insurance. Governments have been largely unable to stop Uber's operations in their jurisdictions because the operations are conducted primarily over the internet. It's between people. So the typical ways in which government controls the labour market is disintegrating. And this has an impact on the future of our society. It also has an impact on us as educators because the expectation of the highly educated is that they have an opportunity to go into a workforce that includes security. Security doesn't exist in this world. And the radicalization, which Professor Richardson talks about, and particularly of the highly educated, may arrive with the emergence of this new world. A world where people are hired on short term, are hired based on what they deliver, and where security is not as we know it today. Already we see our graduates in general spend 4 years in a particular job before they move. That's decreasing to 2 years at the moment. So what we see here is the internet is creating new ways of forming communities that are not tied to physical and material reality, and new ways of interacting that are not based on physical proximity. Because of this and other phenomena, like Bitcoin, which I mentioned, national identity no longer has the defining role in consciousness that it had in the 1960s. So if you take, for instance, the internet, individuals might define themselves according to their Facebook communities or their online gaming friends, then according to their nation. From a social perspective, there is a need for all of society's stakeholders, government, business, academia and civil society to work together to develop a shared view of how this digital technology is reshaping the economic, social, cultural and human context in which we live. The 1916 Rising was a stand against imperialism and for Irish self-determination. I asked the question, is this globalization some form of imperialism? It is also fair to say that the concept of Irish self-determination needs to be redefined in the context of globalized economic and cultural environment. Central to the globalized economy is the free movement of people, because knowledge is the new gold. We are already becoming a multicultural society. This is a very positive aspect of Ireland, but I would ask if our educational system has reorganized itself to address this multicultural environment. These are not visitors. They're not like the students who come into our universities to study for a period of time. These are multicultural environments where people bring their identity and add that identity to our identity. We need to redefine nationalism in the context of this. Also, in terms of in the globalized economy, the role of education and industry. We know that for Ireland, we've put a huge focus on increasing our research capacity. Through Science Foundation Ireland, we've built very large research centres, of which I'm part of one of those centres, and this is a very positive move. However, in a hugely competitive environment, industry is now looking at new means of accessing knowledge in where the risk for the individual industries themselves is decreased. And one of the areas where we see this in particular is in the biopharma industry. The cost of building laboratories to do research for industries is hugely expensive. So many industries are looking to our third level institutions, deciding to put investment into the universities for large research laboratories. Of course, this has a particular advantage because in a globalized world, when there's a shift and technology is hugely disruptive, when there's a shift in technology, then the cost of maintaining that infrastructure is with the university. It is not with the multinational. So the multinational can now shift. And it's interesting when you think in terms of Trump and you think of his policies and his policies of protectionism. In a globalized world, protectionism has no place because in this world, the virtual world and the physical world have come together. So the movement of knowledge, because the world we live in is the world of knowledge. The movement of knowledge around the world can be done at a press of a button, okay? And in actual fact, ironically, when I talk about Uber and the other great companies that are driving this digital environment, the majority are American. Okay, I now want to talk about the digital agenda and the students, some concepts about this. What we have at the moment is, we call them the digital generation. These are students who are growing up constantly connected to the world around them through smartphones, tablets, and computers. Within the third level, we've got the first generation of digital natives coming into our environment. Okay, from an educational perspective, the internet and digitalization is redefining the learning environment. Learning is shifting from issues of authoritativeness to issues of credibility. A major part of the future of learning is in the development of methods, which are often communal, for distinguishing good knowledge sources from those that are questionable. Increasingly, learning is about how to make wise choices epistemologically, methodologically, concerning productive collaborative partnerships to broach complex challenges and problems. So if you ask the question, okay, we have this new generation coming into the third level institutions, what is the difference between the digital generation and previous generations, okay? For one, and I'm not too sure if it's true, but there is some concern that critical thinking is declining as a generation in comparison to that of previous generations. This is based on the belief that the internet encourages students to take information from the internet rather than analysing topics and critically thinking on their own. Nicholas Carr, a prominent evaluator of the internet and its impact, believes that our reliance on researching others' opinions and ideas on the internet is jeopardizing our originality and higher order thinking. We're evolving from cultivators of personal knowledge into hunters and gatherers in an electronic forest. Most third level education is founded on ideas of individual training, discrete discipline, and isolated achievements. Digital technologies increasingly enable and encourage social networking and interactive collaboration engagements, including those impacting learning. Self-learning has bloomed. Discovering online possibilities is a skill now developed from early childhood through advanced adult life. An increasingly horizontal structure of learning puts pressure on how learning institutions enable learning. Institutional education has tended to be authoritative, top-down, standardized, and predicated on individual assessment measures and standardized tests. In the context of the digital generation, the challenges for the educational institutions is to create a community of learners where students have a sense of belonging. We need to ensure that traditional learning networks based on relationship building between the academic and support staff and the student are not sacrificed on the altar, for instance, of league tables, which refers back to the globalization and economic prioritization. Digitization provides a platform which must not replace the relationship but enhances it by providing the student with the level of digital literacy required to become an active citizen of this new globalized digital society. Thank you.
Now, before turning it over, the conversation to you, we have one more respondent this morning, and she is Dr. Niamh Horrigan she's head of Department of Sociology in University College Cork. The bulk of her research has focused on the link between power and inequality in local and global contexts, and her recent monograph is entitled Rule Breakers: Why Being There Trumps Being Fair, which is an interesting title, Niamh, this week. So I invite you to wrap up for the respondents before we pass the conversation over to the floor. Thank you, Niamh.
Good morning, everybody. Sorry, I'm a bit loud. I appreciate you've all been listening for a long time, and I'd like to thank Louise for her paper this morning, and I want to pick up on three themes that she raised. Obviously, I'm coming to this not as an educationalist, but a sociologist and a manager of a university department. So to some extent, my response will also focus on the higher education sector. And I want to start with a point that Louise actually finished with, which was the statistic that 99% of job creation in the American recovery from the financial crisis went to those with more than a secondary education. But it's interesting that even at the end of that process of recovery, 46% of Americans earn $15 an hour or less. And I think that's one of the reasons why Donald Trump's slogan of "Let's make America great again" had such resonance for so many Americans, because for so many of them, their experience of living there is not great. And they're living in a society which is run by an elite who by and large are highly educated and have made very moderate, and some would even say weak, attempts to redistribute the benefits that have accrued from their education. And for 15 years, I've been teaching courses on globalization and development, and those courses have always historically had a focus on the global south, and never in my academic career has there been more convergence between the critiques of globalization coming from the global south and the cries of both the right-wing populist movements and the left-wing movements in the global north, who are united about practically nothing else apart from their critique of the injustices of globalization. Neoliberal globalization has robbed them of jobs by either exporting them to lower cost locations or by replacing them with cheap migrant labor. But also, I think cultural globalization has had quite a corrosive effect, particularly in terms of robbing people of both the certitudes and the certainties, which are kind of not the same but related concepts that Louise discussed. In a recent paper, Jim Spickard wrote very powerfully about how neoliberal globalization has been very successful at marginalizing, for instance, the role of moderate religion in criticizing globalization. And he says that by framing the choice as being between Macworld and jihad, the world's dominant political and economic ideology is let off the hook by destroying the credibility of any religious-based critique. In his book, No Sense of Place, Joshua Merowitz writes about the way in which the technologies linked to globalization that Willie, I think, described so effectively, have eroded people's attachment and belonging and embeddedness to where they were. Again, eroding certainties and perhaps certitudes with it. As a sociologist and a manager of an economic department, it seems to me that one of the deepest wounds that has been generated in this society and other societies in the global north since 2008 has been the systematic attack on the material certainties of ordinary people by neoliberal globalization in the name of particularly flexibility and competitiveness. And I think it's very interesting the way in which our banking crisis was reframed, particularly at the European level, as a crisis of competitiveness rather than a crisis of banking. And I think, for instance, a lot of historically my work focused on the socially excluded in Ireland. And they have, in many cases, suffered from the kinds of inequalities that Dimna outlined and the Fionnuala talked about. But they had some certainties linked to welfare. And many of those certainties, because of structures like Pathways to Work, because of reform of loan education parents, have been dismantled really radically in the last number of years. But I'm currently involved in a research project which looks at anti-austerity protest across Europe. And one of the most prominent themes in this has been the way in which a number of highly educated young people, particularly those in precarious employment, have been radicalized in movements like Occupy, which Louise mentioned, and Indignados in Spain. And as the name Indignados suggests, those young people who are highly educated are indignant. And they're indignant, the cause of their source of their indignation goes right back to the work of Ted Gurr, which Louise highlighted, which I've used in my own work for years. And they're indignant because despite having made it through all the challenges of going to university during the last 10 years, which in many cases, certainly in this country, many people were paying higher fees than those that went before them. The struggle to find accommodation and to pay for that accommodation was greater than it was for those that went before them. And when they graduate, they find themselves in either unpaid jobs, internships, low-paid jobs, jobs with none of the certainties linked to rights, linked to pay, pensions, and conditions, which were enjoyed by the highly educated who went before them. For them, education and university education is not delivering and has not delivered in the way it has done for previous generations. This is not because in some cases they can access employment, but because the jobs are badly paid, their rights are few or non-existent, and the price they pay in other forms of taxes and accommodation is very high. I have to say, as a member of a staff at an Irish university and as a manager at an Irish university, I have been disappointed by the response of the university sector in Ireland to this crisis, in the sense of, instead of being in the vanguard of a critique of this erosion of rights and entitlements in the cause of flexibility and competitiveness, in many cases universities have been in institutions which have been embracing that and taking advantage of that. Throughout the third level system in Ireland since 2008, full-time, permanent, well-paid staff with full rights and entitlements and large pensions have in many cases been replaced by younger people working on short, insecure contracts, or indeed in some cases on postgraduate students who are not being paid full-time salaries at all. And I think that we all know the reasons why the higher education sector has this funding crisis. The Castles report has already been issued, but the survival of the higher education sector and universities during that period, and we have only survived by the skin of our teeth, has been bought at a very high price. And I think the young and the highly educated have paid the bulk of that price. I think it's particularly significant that in the last couple of weeks, where we've seen strike action in the second level sector and in the criminal justice sector by more senior members who are recognising the very difficult circumstances and the very different paying conditions that new entrants in their profession are experiencing, we haven't seen anything like the same manifestation of solidarity with, I think, the younger generation in the higher education sector here in Ireland. And in this sense, I think, given the legacy of James Connolly in particular that we're talking about here today, I think he would be rolling in his grave. Even when we do look at the jobs that are advertised, and I had a quick scan this week, they are in many cases specific purpose contracts. If you're lucky enough to get one, you roll up, you do your job, and then good luck. Your rights and entitlements are minimal. You can be let go at a very short notice. This is an attack on certainties. And I think we have to ask the question, after this week and after Brexit, is whether by continuing to attack the reasonable desire of ordinary people for moderate certainty in their working lives, that we actually create the energy for a searching for more radical certainty. And I think because it's one thing that we see in the current populist movements is they are certain, whatever else you may say about them. And I think in considering the challenges for education in the 21st century in light of the legacy of 1916, I think the challenge not only to have a critique of neoliberal globalization, but to be the critique and to embody the critique in how we operate within our working lives is a particularly important part of that discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Niamh, for putting I suppose, another series of challenges on the agenda this morning. It's now over to you. You've all been sitting very patiently for quite a while now, and we would love to hear. It's difficult for us to see very well, so what I'm going to ask you to do is put up your hands. I'm going to take 3 responses or questions at a time. If you could make them succinct, that means more people can get in. So can we, and there is a mic, so other people can hear you. So questions? One here, right?
Just a question for Professor Devine. About inclusivity. I'm thinking of children in direct provision who attend school with great difficulty. Transport is difficult, money is difficult. They often do well in exams despite working in a foreign language. And then they want to go to university in Ireland, and I wonder if you think the state could do more to make it easier for these children to attend universities. I think they face problems of fees in particular because they're not Irish citizens in most cases. Could you comment on that?
Thank you. I'll take a few and then I'll pass them over. That one was for Dimna. Yes?
Yes, 2 points. One in relation to terrorism. Is it true that the one quality above all others that potential terrorists share is that they're loners and they're targeted as such? The other point is in relation to education. You talk about all the assistance and the finance and the access programs and all that are available, but without parental aspiration, the role of the parent, wish the child to progress, these things are of no value or of little value. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes? Anybody this side?
It's a question to Professor Richardson. If she has anything to mention in relation to the effect of possible total Brexit happening, and in relation to Irish students either going to go for their primary degree, or where it has been more and more for the postgraduates of our young people who with pride would have thought to be there in Oxford, but who now are fearful of that opportunity. And I think you also have spoken of the uncertainty of the Irish in England who are uncertain of their future, particularly in working in education and other fields, and who may leave before the funding goes.
Thank you. I'm going to pass these 3 questions now to the panel. Dimna, would you take the one on the children in state response? And then there were 2 specific ones for Louise, and I think perhaps others may wish to comment on the parental aspiration.
Okay, I'm not sure in the question if you're referring specifically to children and young people who are in reception centres, or you're referring more broadly to immigrant children that are in the education system. To both, okay. So I would say that our record in relation to the processing of claims in relation to asylum and refugee status in this country is not one that we can be proud of. And I think that's something that historically is not something that we can be proud of. We actually have a very poor record in that area. And I think the situation in relation to the length of time that some children are living within reception centres is a stain actually on our record. More widely in relation to access to third level education, yes, I think it should be there. I mean, it links into my idea around and the assertion of education as a public good. We know actually from the research in relation to immigrant children in the Irish education system, and the children in the reception centres are no different, is that they're highly ambitious, highly determined to do well, want to be part of Irish society, and when they're given the opportunity to do so, they actually do add considerable value to the schools and classrooms that they are in. Now, I could go into some of the reasons for that because it is ironically often tied actually to social background. But I think from a human rights perspective, from a child rights perspective, and also the idea of diversity and supporting diversity within all sectors of education, including higher education, yes, they should be entitled to those sort of free fees or EU citizen fees.
Thank you.
On the questions relating to terrorism, actually, no, I don't. You sound like you can't hear me. On the questions related to terrorism, actually, no, terrorists by and large are not loners. It's often quite a social activity. I tracked one football team in Gaza, the entire side volunteered to become suicide bombers. Mark Sageman has tracked North African Islamists and describes them as groups of guys. So very often, in fact, it's not loners, but groups who support one another. There's a whole networks of terrorist groups. So by and large, they're not the isolated loner. I mean, an individual lone wolf attack would be, but not a terrorist group, or not a group that not an individual dispatched by a group. So individuals who commit terrorist acts, like the character in Orlando, for example, would be a loner, but not terrorist groups tend to not to recruit loners because they see them as security risks. On the question of Brexit and Irish students in Britain, there's over 11,000 Irish students in Britain, and the future is quite uncertain for them. British government has said that for undergraduates applying this year, or indeed applying next year, they will be guaranteed EU fees, but thereafter all bets are off, and we haven't even gotten that guarantee for postgraduates. But Brexit poses quite a threat to us. 15% of our students, that is to say Oxford students, are citizens of the EU, and we fully anticipate that that number will decline unless we can manage to fundraise for them. We will endeavour to fundraise for the delta between home and international fees, but we're not going to be able to make up the difference. So we anticipate that that number will decline. 17% of our staff are citizens of the EU, many of them Irish citizens. We tend to assume that they will be able to remain. I'm confident they will be, but the government has not guaranteed that. Now, as we know, the arrangements for passport-free travel between Britain and Ireland long predate membership of the EEC, and yet Prime Minister May has given no indications that she will give separate treatment to Ireland. Again, we anticipate that we will get special treatment, but again, it's not guaranteed. So it's a significant concern. It's also, there are some opportunities for Irish universities here, because I think British academics are vulnerable to being poached at the moment if they're concerned about their research being funded. Because the biggest fear for us is that 12% of our research funding, £67 million last year, comes from the ERC. Academics whose research is funded in that way are likely to be very worried, be very vulnerable to being poached. Some are frankly pretty upset at being treated as being suddenly feeling unwelcome in Britain. So some may take it upon themselves to leave. We have lots of anecdotal evidence of people pulling out of job searches and taking positions in Europe precisely because of this. So it's a real challenge for British universities. We're working hard to try and lobby the government to see sense on this. They're unwilling to, as we know, as on other issues, unwilling to reveal a negotiating position. Just on the number of British people in Ireland, as we know, there was a surge, or in Britain, Irish people in Britain, there was a surge of applications for Irish passports. The BBC calculated that 6.7 million people living in Ireland are, in Britain, Irish people living in Britain are eligible for British passports.
Do any of the panel want to comment on the observation about parental aspiration? Okay, Willie?
Yes, a few points. Just a story to start with. One of our courses, we have interviews for students who go into the course, and one young 18-year-old came in, and when we asked him the question, why do you want to do this course? He said, because my mother wants me to do it, and the mother was sitting outside. So I don't think that's what you mean in terms of parental influence. But I think it's very important. I mean, when you look at the statistics of people coming from working class backgrounds into third level, there are 2 points. One is you need role models. You need people who aspire for you. You need an environment. It's very clear that children, people who come from working class backgrounds who succeed and go to third level, right, their children naturally go to third level and compete at the highest level. So definitely role models, the environment you're brought up at, the expectations of your family. It's a horizon. Where is your horizon at, and how do you raise that horizon? But I'd bring out another point to this as well, and it's to do the environment in which children are being educated. Not all schools are the same. If you're going to a private school, the resources that are there in a private school are not the same as the resources in some of the inner city schools. And one of the things that we need to reflect on as educators is that the point system, I would contend that somebody who comes from a private school, from a school that where the majority of the students come from a highly educated backgrounds, professional backgrounds, for them to, say, get 550 points. If you take a similar student who comes from an inner city or a school with minimum amount of resources and gets 400 points. That achievement is an extraordinary achievement. And, you know, this is one of the issues I have with our educational system, is how we actually recognise the achievement of the individual, taking into context the environment in which they're educated. But the parents are absolutely essential in the whole process.
Yes,
Could I just make
yes,
a short
Fionnuala,
comment as well,
please.
in terms of expectations and drawing more on my decades of experience as a teacher in areas of social disadvantage. You can always bring up individual cases where this doesn't follow, I suppose, but in general I would say the issue isn't around parental expectations, it's around the expectations of teachers, the expectations of schools. It's around what people see as an education that is suitable for particular categories of children. It's about the ceilings we place on what children can do. That's the issue, not the parental expectations.
Thank you. Have we any more questions from the floor? Yeah?
Hello. First of all, I want to thank the educators in the room here. The last time I was in this hall, my son was graduating in June in medicine. And the reason I say that, I'm very proud of him, but I lived in the United States, and I think sometimes we forget at these conferences that Ireland is an incredible country. If I didn't return from the United States, I don't think I'd have 4 children. I possibly only would have 2. So that was an important point that was made, that we are a society, we have a very good birth rate in Ireland and our young people. The other thing is the primary school education in Ireland is wonderful. My son, if he was in the United States, would probably have a huge loan. You know, he's leaving, he has an education now and go into the world as a doctor without any loans or anything else. So I thank NUIG for that as well. And the secondary school education, he went through the community college that was very impoverished. Was very lucky to have people graduate when I was there. You know, their intercert, let alone a leaving cert. So I want to thank all the educators, and we should remember that. The university challenge, I work in the environmental field, I did in the United States, and I go around the globe. And this is a question particularly for the 2 heads of the universities. First of all, thank you, Professor Richardson, for coming over from the United Kingdom. And I can't imagine the ceilings that you've broken to get to your positions, both in Harvard and St. Andrews, and now in Oxford. So for our generation, it's incredible to see you as an Irish woman, and I was very proud to read of your career, so thank you for that. But both to Mr. Donnelly as well, Professor Donnelly and Professor Richardson, the universities largely prostitute themselves to businesses. And I'll cite an example that's relevant to both Oxford. Oxford sits on pesticide research, you know, that could help the developing countries. But businesses, because of the risk, you know, tie you up with NDAs. In Ireland, biopharma with agriculture. Anybody in this room today, I'll challenge you to find a chicken without antibiotics in it, even though we have banned it since 2006. So the question is, can you go back to your universities and empower your professors to release the education and that can help with globalization and can help with, you know, is that something? How do we free up the academics instead of muzzling them? Because we have fabulous people in our universities, but they get muzzled by this concentration on what's good for business and jobs. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just see if there are any more questions. Yes, we've got one here.
There's one question on my mind. I've been at dozens of seminars like this over the last 50 years. This one today is the most diverse I've ever attended. But there's one question that has come to my mind several times, and that is, what is the origin of misogyny in Western civilization? After all, 1,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, under the Brehon Law, we had divorce was legal, and in mythology and reality, women were treated as heroines, like Queen Maeve of Táin Cúailnge, and then of course 16th century Gráinne Mhaol. And it just struck me there now that they were both Connacht or women, sorry, one Roscommon and the other Mayo. But I can't understand how there's been so much the attitude to women, and that when you think of it, we didn't have a full cabinet, a female member of the cabinet until the 1970s, I think, Maura Geoghegan Quinn. So I'd like to know the panel's opinion on the origins of misogyny.
Okay, any other questions before? Okay, now I can't see very well, but there's a lady here in the 4th row. Yes?
I'd like to thank the panel very much for a very interesting morning. But I'd also like to ask about the role of learning in later life. We haven't heard anything at all about that. The concentration has been, as it indeed should be, on early learning. I come from a background where I've been working for quite a while in educational guidance for people who come from non-traditional backgrounds through access into a third level institution. And one of the things in my own later life that I'm very aware of is the paucity of opportunity that our universities are offering for later life learning. Now we've got some chances through the wonderful introduction of free digital learning through courses such as FutureLearn. But I'm finding that the opportunities to engage in a classroom or in a communal learning situation are limited, and I believe myself have become even more limited since the change from vocational education committees to the LCETB situation, which of course, much like the universities themselves, is now focused on the acquisition of skills that lead to job opportunities. I totally understand that value being attached to education, but I lament the opportunities in this country. I'm thinking of the comparison with my friends in Northern Ireland, who in their later lives are well able to engage with a variety of fun and learning opportunities through organisations like the University of the Third Age, which, while it's supported here, is not in anything like the same form available. And our individual higher education institutions, through all the constraints, some of which I certainly understand, lack of funding and so on, are not offering a perspective of learning as a life course opportunity for us. And I'd like to hear from the panel on that topic. Thank you.
Okay, I'll take one more if I have. Yes, okay.
I'd like to raise the issue about students coming from underprivileged backgrounds going to university. When I came to college in the 60s, we had scholarships which were more than adequate for covering for the year's expenses. Nowadays, students don't have that ability. I note the change in Britain where there was a grant scheme and now it's gone to a loan scheme. I also note that some of the private colleges and university in the US, like Harvard and Princeton, basically give students a guarantee they won't graduate without a loan. In fact, the last figure I saw was 84% in Princeton graduate without any loan. And yet we are going back toward the loan system. So is the model of how students should be funded and whether or not you take care of students' background in that case should be just an issue I'd like to raise.
Thank you. Excellent question. So student funding, lifelong learning, the origin of misogyny in Western civilization, no lack of scope there, and globalization. Now, Niamh, you haven't yet responded. Yeah. Would you like to respond to any of those that
Yeah,
you wish?
I think I'll start with this question over here about funding, because it actually links into the question about the University of the Third Age as well. And the commenter who talked about parental aspiration, there's one particularly interesting study which looks at kids from more marginalised backgrounds coming through the system. And one of the things that comes across really critically is that even if you have, kind of parents with a lot of aspiration, that middle class parents are actually much better at guiding their children through the leapfrog obstacle course of the point system and of getting into university. And that if we look at the cuts in particular that were made to guidance during the kind of structural readjustment period, they actually hit those kids from marginalised backgrounds, even where there was parental aspiration, harder because the parents didn't have the capacity to kind of help their kids negotiate the hurdles. And I think in a sense how that feeds in as another level into the into the third age question, is I do feel that there is an issue for higher education in the fact that we have tended to look at lifelong learning. There's great aspirations toward lifelong learning, but when you look at how they come to be played out, they tend to be played out a lot in terms of CPD, which is continuing professional development. So our idea is that, well, if you're a social worker, or if you're a teacher, or if you can come back and you can do X and Y and Z, and there's very good reasons for doing that. But the broader kind of lifelong learning issues, and again, this is the issue of resources, have been eroded. I think there's a bigger context, though, here, which will link into actually things like retirement and pensions and that whole other question of the third age and what that's going to look like in the future. Because one of the issues that has come up in relation, and I've written a number of pieces about this, Bernie Sanders, when he was running for his campaign against Hillary Clinton, very much focused on the issue of student debt. And one of the things he highlighted were the number of Americans who are carrying large volumes of student debt right up to retirement. And that was not only impacting on their capacity to access housing, which we could imagine, but also impacting on their capacity to save for their pensions and for the third. So I think there's a web of interrelate. That's not to say that loans in and of themselves can necessarily always be a bad thing. We have a phenomenon here at the moment whereby it's so difficult to access grant funding for postgraduate education that I personally believe a lot of students from more marginalised backgrounds who are getting grants to complete their primary degree are getting trapped in the arts, humanities and social sciences because they're not able to get funding to do the postgrad. And the postgrad is the bit that kind of converts their primary degree in real terms. So there's an issue there that's going to have to be addressed, but they're intersected, and I agree with this. I certainly don't think the road of going down the loan route is one that we need to just run wholeheartedly down and go, that's fine, it'll all be grand. If we look at the torturous discussions that we've had around water, you know, people are, I'm sure you're all aware that there's a proposed referendum to look at the question of who owns Irish water. Those kinds of questions about what, if you put a new charge or a new system in place, what kind of guarantees, what kind of certainties are there for people? Those are questions that have to be asked beforehand, not after you introduce it and go, sure, it'll all be grand. You know, long experience would suggest that it probably won't. So.
Thank you. Any other members of the panel want to respond specifically to any of these issues?
I'll just pick up the one on misogyny. And I'm not going to try and trace back the historical origins of misogyny, but I actually think it taps into something important, because I think we do need to ask ourselves very seriously how our education system is sustaining or failing to challenge narratives like misogyny and racism, and I could keep going, but I won't. But you know, it's looking at what vision we have for education, what we see as the aim of education, and this relentless drive towards education for the economy, to my mind, which is leaving education and society completely out of or largely out of the picture in terms of the kinds of policies that are emerging in the education space in Ireland at the moment. So I think it's a very legitimate question, but it's more about how education is or is not or should be challenging misogyny, racism, xenophobia, and so forth.
Can I just maybe add to that and sort of trying to get some sort of a connecting point between the diverse questions, and centrally these are issues of power. Who has power? How is power used? When particular groups have power, they don't necessarily want to lose that power. When we see greater opportunities actually in education systems, it's not typically because there's a lessening of socioeconomic differences or a lessening of power of particular social groups. It's that more opportunities or more vacant places are created that expand opportunities for other people to also gain some measure of advantage. I also think it comes back to questions around whether or not we want education to be a public enterprise or a private enterprise. And that's a particular challenge that we have there in the university sector, because with the neoliberal reform, with the rollback, if you like, of the state in the provision of welfare and public services, that squeezes universities in terms of the type of public education that they can provide. at a time when we have an era of qualification inflation, where it isn't enough anymore even to have an undergraduate degree. It is actually to have your postgraduate and eventually your doctoral qualification. So the stakes are constantly rising in education, and at the same time as the pressures on schools, on universities to actually perform within a contracting financial model of funding for education. And I might add, the same thing has applied in relation to the development of the early years sector. I find it quite extraordinary from a point of principle that the early years sector has actually developed as a private model of education. And if we were to start off and say, let's actually allow primary schools to be set up by private business, our profit making, would we find that okay? The very same principles are being applied increasingly to the university sector and have been embedded in our provision of early years education. And that is fundamental questions around education, around power, and the public nature of education versus the private nature of it.
Thank you.
Should I take up?
I'm going to, Nicholas, what sort of housekeeping have we got? I can take 10 minutes more, great. I'm going to go to Willie, and then I'm going to ask Louise to reflect, and then let's see what kind of time we have.
Just on the response of relationship with industry and working with industry, I've worked for 20 years with industry in an academic environment, so this isn't a kind of a conversion on the road to Damascus. I believe that that relationship is very, very important. I believe the further development of the relationship, because if it's a relationship of equals, if it's a relationship where each side share information, I think within a science and engineering, you're finding a movement now to actually the development of more open solutions. There's one fantastic research group here in Galway called DERRY, and they're at the forefront of this whole concept of open web, open data. And what's happening now is that industry and academia are coming together to find solutions that are more open, that are available to everybody, in which industry themselves can build on top of and create wealth that way. So from my viewpoint, I don't have an issue with working with industry. I feel that the problem is that it's a problem of how government views the role of academia and research. This is an issue. So, for instance, sometimes we're very short-sighted. If the case is that we're only focusing on the STEM subjects and we're investing in those and we're allowing industry to dictate where we should be going, industry's time span is very short. And industry in a globalized world can shift that emphasis and shift the resources very quickly. And I'll give you one example where we as a nation, I think, have been remiss in terms of our own policy on research. Now that the internet has matured and we're in the kind of the second phase of the internet, the focus from the technology companies is more on the creative industries. It's more on design, it's more on arts, it's more on humanities. And we've missed out on that, because there has been no encouragement in Ireland through the funding agencies for multidisciplinary teams. Yeah. And this is what we need. So we as a country and our policymakers need to look beyond. The relationship with industry is important, but we have to develop a philosophy around and a policy around where we want to go in the long term. And we need to leverage all of the areas of intellectual capacity that we have.
Thank you. May I ask you to, if you like, mop up where you want to comment, Louise?
Well, just two questions I think were probably particularly addressed to me, one on access and one this question of links with industry. My message on access would be, beware those selling simplistic solutions. I mean, we spend £18 million a year on access, scholarships and trying to identify, recruit and support kids from deprived backgrounds, and yet it's no secret that the socioeconomic mix of our students is not what it might be. 40% of our students are privately educated in a country in which only 7% of the population is. Now, one could see that as an indictment of an elite institution. I prefer to see it as an indictment of the public education sector, but no doubt both could do more. But having spent 7 years in Scotland, where university education is free, it turns out that's a massive middle-class subsidy, and the number of poor kids attending university in Scotland, where there is no tuition, is less than the number attending university in England, where there is a £9,000 income contingent loan. So having educated my children in America, I was very struck by the data point coming over here that 84% of kids graduate from Princeton without a debt, but I would be deeply skeptical of that figure. My children graduated from Harvard without debt, but only because my husband and I pay their extraordinarily high fees. It wasn't because the university helps them. So I think students, the wealthiest universities in America can afford to provide full subsidies to very poor kids, but they do. The rate of debt is still high. And just another data point that might surprise you: 10% of the students at Oxford come from families eligible for free school meals. That is to say, their family income is less than £16,000 a year. But 30% of those students have been privately educated. And that's because of the scholarship programs at elite institutions. So all of which is just to say, beware of those selling simplistic solutions and too simple data points. To the gentleman on the right, and thank you very much for your kind comments, and I have some sympathy with what you're saying about the links between universities and industry. And to be perfectly honest, having spent so much of my career outside Ireland, I'm very struck by how close the links between industry and universities are here. And I see that as a consequence of the inadequate government investment in education. So universities are going for the support where they can find it. But I really worry that universities are spending a little too much attention trying to produce a skilled workforce and not separating themselves enough from industry. As to muzzling academics, I know better than to trying to muzzle my academics, and I would warn anybody who tried to off a futile effort. But I guess I would go back to Mill in the end, where I ended my comments. Mill said, the purpose of universities is not to produce trained shoemakers, lawyers, doctors, whatever. The purpose of a university is to create cultivated human beings. And if we do that, they will make themselves good shoemakers and doctors and lawyers. And I think it's imperative that at this time of economic constraint, we not forget the role of universities in educating the whole person and not simply supplying skilled workers to the workforce.
Okay, well, I would like, just before thanking our panel and our wonderful key speaker, to just add a couple of quick comments as a way of wrapping up. Those of you who know me, I promise not to talk about investment and finance, because actually Louise has said what I completely agree with. It's an incredibly complex set of issues, and we haven't done very well on it. I don't think we've made the right choices ourselves in Ireland over the last 10 years, but this is not the forum to discuss that. I would like just to finish by saying I think this has been a wonderful discussion because we began with a series of challenges. I think people here listened and responded. And where we've ended up probably is knowing that somewhere out there in this globalized world, there are a frightening series of unknown unknowns. And to quote Mr. Rumsfeld, and unless we have an educated population capable of making the broadest and least judgmental kind of judgments, Ireland will not succeed in the years ahead. So the challenge is huge. I thank you all for your respectful attention this morning. I want to thank Louise Richardson, who is an inspiration to us, to the panel for responding to her paper, and you all. Thank you very much.